Okay, Steve, can you please start? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's exactly 1 o'clock South African time, and welcome to this webinar today on secessionism, self-determination, and the role of digital diplomacy, looking at the case studies of Somaliland and the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. I'm Stephen Grusd, and I head up our African Governance and Diplomacy program, and it is my duty to welcome you all here. This is also part of the series of events that SIRE is putting on during our 90th birthday celebrations. We turned 90 years old, having been established in 1934. But you're not here to listen to me, so I'm going to hand you over to our moderator for the day. But just to mention that Dr. Michelle Small has recently been appointed as a member representing African states to the United Nations Working Group on the Use of Mercenaries as a means of violating human rights and impeding the exercise of the right of peoples to self-determination. She's also a lecturer at the Department of International Relations at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. So, Michelle, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for that generous introduction. And what a great moment to be part of this discussion today, a really timely launch of this report. It's a very thought-provoking read. I think it's great because I've managed to see it from draft to launch, so that's been an especial privilege. Thank you to the contributors. Even more great because 3 of the contributors are former students at WITS, so they're flying that WITS flag very high. And then also the moment that we find ourselves in today regarding these geopolitical politics, tensions, anomalies, and contradictions in terms of statehood in international relations. So my job for today is really to give you an idea of the structure of the webinar today. It will proceed in 3 parts. The first is that the SIRE contributors will present for 20 minutes on the paper. The second part, we will open it to our panelists, and they'll be posed some questions in regard to their own work on this issue and connecting it to the report. And then the third part is we will open this up to a wider discussion with the audience. So the audience, may I please ask you to use the chat function throughout the presentations to list your questions and to specify who that question is addressed to. Just to introduce our contributors for today, our 2 SIRE researchers are Ms. Isabel Bosman, and she is a researcher at SIRE's African Governance and Diplomacy program. She's particularly specialized on this nexus between technology and politics. She was also a former Konrad Adenauer Foundation scholar, and she works on nuclear stuff, which is of interest to me. And then Ms. Rubridge, who is a foreign policy researcher at SIRE and also the coordinator in the Office of the Director of Research. And Laura, I hope you won't mind me boasting, but you graduated cum laude in your MA degree, so very well done there. We then have 3 panelists for today, Professor Carlson and Iyangwe, who I believe will be joining us today. Who is a professor in international law, has taught at many universities across Africa, but has real empirical experience here, given that Professor Carlson appeared in front of the AU Commission on Human and People's Rights, representing South Cameroon's case in 2003 and 27. We then also have Professor Reddy Berekatiab, who is a senior researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute, as well as a professor and non-resident senior fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. And finally, we have Ms. Kendra Konak, who is a sessional lecturer at the University of the Witwatersrand and also a PhD candidate in international relations, as well as being a former CAS scholar at SIRE. So without further ado, I hand the floor to Isabel and Laura.
Thank you, Michelle, for your kind introduction. As mentioned, Laura and I will sort of be tag teaming on this one and sharing 2 related presentations. So I, as you mentioned, worked with Laura Robich and Kendra Connick on this paper that we are using today as the foundation for our discussion. It is titled Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic and Somaliland, the Struggle for Recognition. And we will share the link to that paper with our participants in the chat box. We're not going to discuss the specificities really of these two cases, but rather by means of laying the foundation for this broader discussion that we're having in this webinar today, discuss secessionism and self-determination in Africa. And then I will hand over to Laura to focus more on the digital diplomacy aspect. We can move the slide. So just to kick us off then, discussing these two differing but linked concepts, secessionism and self-determination, we find that research into secessionism and self-determination on the continent generally focuses on the aspect of conflict. It's often reduced to insurrection and terrorism, and it is quite widely geographically dispersed across the continent. But what we do note is that different cases receive different treatment. While research mainly has been focusing on this aspect of conflict, we actually find that the issues of self-determination and secessionism is far more nuanced, and the aspects of diplomacy, international law, and multilateralism are often overlooked and require more attention. And that is really what we want to center the discussion on today. So although secessionist goals remain just that, with only so far on the continent, South Sudan and Eritrea successfully becoming new states, which is well noted as exceptional circumstances, these calls frequently oscillate in that they're never fully gone, and often increase around election season. So an example of that very recently is when the Kenyan opposition, Raila Odinga, who received 48.8% of the presidential vote in 2022, called for Kenya to be split into two republics. And the significant number of votes received from this campaign allude to a society that is open to the idea of secession for the sake of better governance. This sentiment, which has also been seen elsewhere on the continent, is miles away from the hard line that's taken by the continental policy leaders at the AU against secession. So although it consistently denounces secession, the AU and the international community have treated varying cases where we have seen this fall very differently. And two such examples are, of course, what we focus on in the paper that I mentioned at the start of my presentation, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic and Somaliland. So our paper considers these two cases because for us, they indicate this differentiation between self-determination and secession, which, although linked, are very distinct. So self-determination being linked more to this idea of state formation, and it is also recognized in international agreement, whereas secession simply just means withdrawal from an existing state. We know that self-determination is well recognized in international and multilateral agreements, including the UN's General Assembly Resolution 1514, which states, quote, "All peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development." Close quote. The UN International Covenant of 1966 echoes those sentiments and says, all peoples have the right to self-determination, creating sovereign statehood. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. So in terms of what we kind of found in the paper, and I'm glad that we have Professor Baraketi up with us on this panel, because we actually consulted his work at length when we were writing this paper. Somaliland represents his third classification, a state that voluntarily rescinded its independence and was absorbed into a larger state. So for a brief period of 5 days in 1960, Somaliland was independent. It was part of the larger territory known as British Somaliland, and it was absorbed into Italian Somaliland to become what is today known to us as Somalia, with French Somaliland becoming Djibouti. But this does not remove its right to self-determination, which is enshrined in the General Assembly Resolution 1514. And following the collapse of the Somali Republic, it therefore sought to reclaim its independence. And Bereketi terms this retrieving the sovereignty that they willingly put aside. In the case of the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, we see a different kind of struggle towards self-determination instead. So it was colonized, Western Sahara, the area it's in Western Sahara was colonized by Spain from 1884 to 1975. But in 1975, Spain ceded control of the territory to Mauritania and to Morocco. So the territory of Western Sahara was never able to enjoy a kind of decolonized state owing to its immediate annexation by another entity. And as we write in the paper, it is in effect Africa's last colony. So while Somaliland is on a quest for secession, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic is aiming for self-determination. And this could perhaps explain why the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic has garnered more support from the AU. And then I'd like to just draw your attention to one of the tables that we have drawn up for the paper, where we look at these 4 cases, so Eritrea and South Sudan, who were successful in their quest for independent statehood, and then Western Sahara and Somaliland, and looking at the 4 trajectories towards sovereignty as contained in the Montevideo Convention. So we see there are kind of 4 elements, according to this convention, that have to be present for a territory to qualify as a state. Those are the presence of a permanent population, a defined territory, government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. So we see that in all these cases, Eritrea and Sudan meet those criteria. Eritrea also received external support for its sovereignty claims from China, while South Sudan received support for its sovereignty claims from Egypt and Libya. And in both those cases, we see the presence of a violent conflict or contestation, and both have also been granted membership post-independence to the African Union. In the case of Western Sahara, or the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, then in terms of the presence of a permanent population, we note that the Sahrawi people are nomadic by nature and currently relegated to refugee camps primarily in Algeria. Indeed, it has a defined territory, it has a government in exile, and it has very limited capacity to enter into relations with other states. At present, it receives external support for sovereignty from Algeria. And in this case, there has also been violent conflict or contestation present. Western Sahara was granted membership to the African Union in 1982. In the case of Somaliland, by contrast, we do also see the presence of a permanent population, but the territory is contested and its government is contested. And in terms of capacity to enter into relations with other states, we find that despite willingness on the part of Somaliland to engage in external relations, official relations remain limited. And my colleague Laura will go more into that in her presentation. In terms of external support for sovereignty claims, following that brief period of independence, Somaliland was previously internationally recognized, but after it joined the bigger union and redeclaring its independence in 1991, Somaliland has not received international recognition or support. There is also the presence of a violent conflict or contestation, but Somaliland is not a member of the African Union. So despite similarities and differences in the exact circumstances of both these quasi-states and the different levels of recognition they have achieved, there is a distinction to be made in the basis upon which independence is sought in each case. So recognizing the potential for turmoil following decolonization, the Organization of African Unity, the predecessor of the AU, declared the colonial borders, arbitrary as they may be, sacrosanct. The secession of South Sudan in 2011 has set an interesting precedent and left many wondering whether a new era in self-determination and secession was afoot. But in the case of Somaliland and the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic's quest for formal statehood, we can see that this has not been the case. And the sanctity of colonial borders has seemingly been allowed to triumph over the people that are affected by them every day. So we conclude in the paper that it remains to be seen what, if any, final decisions will ever be made on the independence of these two territories. The success for their quest for independence may lie in the successes of their forerunners, Eritrea and South Sudan, or they could forge entirely new paths towards independence. I would encourage you all to read the paper if you want to get more background and delve into the more like the finities of things. But I am now going to hand over to my colleague Laura, who's going to present some independent research that she has conducted on digital diplomacy in Somaliland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. So I'm going to pivot the conversation a little bit now to closer examination of Somaliland and the use of digital diplomacy in its quest for recognition. And as Isabel said, this is independent research that I've done. It actually formed part of my master's research report, which was accepted in 2023. And the report basically used a methodology of scraping large metadata from Somaliland official foreign policy accounts. From their social media platform formerly known as X, so this is Twitter, and it really considers the question of, can digital diplomacy be used as a tool for peaceful secession by de facto states? For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to very loosely define digital diplomacy as the intersection of information communication technologies and the function of diplomacy. So the use of digital diplomacy by de facto states and secessionist groups is a very under-researched area. Papers that do touch on this intersection have really departed from a securitized starting point, and they often overemphasize the use of sharp power. This is misinformation and disinformation by these groups vying for recognition. And a lot of the time, this overemphasis has led to the literature becoming deterministic in its assumption that the use of digital diplomacy by these secessionist groups will inevitably lead to or exacerbate conflict and violence. So the study questions or interrogates this assumption. Barring the brief independence in 1960, Somaliland has very strongly and persistently been arguing for its case of independence since 1991. In its 2020 official comprehensive foreign policy document, it declared that securing international recognition is the guiding principle of its foreign policy. So when I started the research, I really thought or expected to see that international recognition would be placed at the forefront of its digital diplomacy or foreign policy, as it is in its offline foreign policy. But this was not really the case. From the chart, you can see that most of the tweets coming out of the Somaliland Ministry and Foreign Affairs account 31% spoke to Somaliland's relations with other states. 16% focused on the nation branding, and only 8.5% focused on promoting Somaliland's independence, sovereignty, and recognition. A similar exercise was conducted across all of the Somaliland official foreign mission accounts, and the trend really continued, with an overall focus predominantly on nation branding and relations with external states, and significantly less emphasis on independence, sovereignty, and recognition. So the study found that rather than using social media to promote its recognition directly, Somaliland was using its social media as an alternative means of conducting diplomacy. In some ways, it was bypassing the limitations on traditional diplomacy, given that its de facto status. The paper concludes and outlines 3 key advantages of digital diplomacy as a means for foreign policy for these de facto states. The first is providing a loophole to economic isolation. As a de facto state, its economic situation has been likened to a state facing the toughest economic sanctions, with its borders, passports, and currencies largely unrecognized and untransferable. The report found that the Somaliland official accounts used Twitter to promote its international investment and funding by other means. In one example, the international solidarity expressed on Twitter for the Hargeisa fire produced remarkable financial pledges from international governments, including the United Kingdom, Canada, the US, and France. In another example, the promotion of foreign investment by Somaliland or in Somaliland's economic opportunities received noticeable attention. As a de facto state, it has limited capacity to host or attend multilateral investment conferences in the traditional manner. But Twitter provided a less controversial platform to promote its investment opportunities. And there is evidence that significant investment has been received since. And the prominent example is the expansion of the Barbera port. The second key advantage that social media provided Somaliland in its de facto state is a platform for building and maintaining, albeit informal, bilateral and multilateral relations. Through Twitter, Somaliland government has strengthened and prioritized bilateral relations with several regional and some international partners. For example, the creation of virtual embassies through official Twitter accounts allows for continuous dialogue between Somaliland and these partner states, which otherwise would be restricted. As discussed in the report, many states have refrained from sending permanent diplomatic missions to Somaliland for fear of retaliation. Diplomatic dialogue over Twitter does not seem to return the same retaliation as a formal state visit. And we've seen dramatic action taken by Somaliland to cut diplomatic ties with Kenya and Ethiopia when former diplomatic visits have been conducted. And the same reaction really isn't seen when these foreign states mention Somaliland on Twitter as a partner. And the third and final advantage in the report, identified in the report, is that digital diplomacy provides Somaliland with a platform to voice its views on geopolitical dynamics. As a de facto state, Somaliland is excluded from most multilateral institutions, including the United Nations and the African Union. And in an attempt to bypass these restrictions, this report found evidence that Somaliland has used its Twitter accounts to contribute to the discussions on geopolitical dynamics. For example, it has used its account with the USA accounts to voice its concerns about China's expansion in the Horn of Africa. So in some ways, social media has allowed Somaliland to divert its foreign policy focus away from solely or predominantly vying for international recognition and secessionism. And it's allowed it to build a stronger case for statehood and self-determination. And this perhaps brings it closer to what Isabel was explaining in our report as being more acceptable to the international community. But has it really furthered the quest for international recognition? The report wasn't able to find any indication that digital diplomacy has actually brought the case further. Rather, it shows that Somaliland has used digital diplomacy to adapt and bypass some of the restrictions. And in closing, I'd really like to bring some questions that both our reports have in the end of it, and hopefully we can unpack these more in the discussion. And this is largely based on a statement by the Somaliland's foreign ministry. And he said in 2017, when pleading for international community to aid in the hunger crisis, that Somaliland suffers from a syndrome of being a good child. The naughty children get all the attention. And looking back at the track record of successful secessionist groups on the African continent since independence, it's clear that it's not necessarily the good children that get rewarded. So it's really a question of where do we go now? What needs to happen? Thank you very much, Michelle. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Laura and Isabel. I will just say, I think it's affecting you as well. We do have unstable connections at WITS, but I will proceed and hope it stays on. So thank you very much for taking us through those cases. I think the similarities and differences are very useful in thinking through not only like case law, why do some states get recognition and others do not, but also introducing this new variable about the virtual domain. That's really insightful. I will not hog the floor. I'm going to hand over to the panelists. I do not know if Professor Carlson has joined us or not.
Yes, I'm right here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Carlson, and welcome. The reason I call on you first is because in your work, you speak about this tug of war between self-determination and territorial integrity. And you say that the two norms are not always in conflict, but can actually complement one another. So based on the presentations and, the AU Commission, as well as Ethiopia's recent memorandum of understanding with Somaliland, there is this shift away from the idea of territorial integrity. So I wonder if you can take us through your thoughts in light of the presentation and in light of your work there. And that's my question to you. And then for Professor Reddy, I wonder if you can talk to us about this variable of violence that was shown in the table, or what Laura calls the naughty children, where violence, war, and conflict, armed resistance are common features in the pursuit for statehood. And actually in your work, you say that if the aim of self-determination is secession, certain conditions have to be met, and one of those is peace, stability, development. So the question to you there is, do you believe that if secessionist movements meet these conditions, they are more likely to gain international support, especially in relation to the examples we've just been taken through? As well as, Eritrea and Sudan, who've shown to be the naughty children here. And then to our third panelist, if I can also bring you in here with regards to the presentations, as well as your work, if you could perhaps reflect on the role of the external, the role of the international. So what roles international allies play for both the de facto states, as well as the parent state, in terms of this pursuit for international recognition. And again, bringing us back to Ethiopia and Somaliland, there's a whole geopolitical dimension there whereby, Ethiopia in its memorandum of understanding has, signed a lease about access to sea and a military base. So tying it in with what's been presented as well as the other panelists' work. So Professor Carlson, if I can call on you first.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me begin by saying that a number of things. One, states don't appear to object to unions, right? When states or countries want to come together, everybody thinks that's a normal thing to do. And yet we know that this question of states coming together to build an empire or kingdom, whatever thing it is, was deconstructed by the Westphalian state system. So states have. Second thing is the way the world has developed. It has developed not through a process of fusion, but a process of fission. That's why I have so many states today, unlike in the previous times when there were just fewer states. So that is a reality which we must accept, that states will continue to be created, whether we like it or not, if only because you cannot force people to be where they don't want to be. Second thing I want to say is that we have always assumed, and especially on this continent, that secession is not allowed. It is something which is bad. No. I think the last advisory decision in the Kosovo case made it very clear. Unilateral declarations of independence or secession, as some call it, is not against international law. Because all of these countries, African countries, we tend to forget that every African country has become independent either by consensual declaration of independence or forcible declaration of independence by seceding from the territory of the imperial power. Just do not forget, these colonial territories were considered the territories of the colonizers. So by asserting independence, the African countries, the several African countries, were seceding from the territory of the colonial authority. Third thing I just want to say is that there is a difference between external self-determination and internal self-determination. Now, when external self-determination is being asserted, as far as I can see, the international community, under international law, they are more likely to accept it if it has less destabilizing effect. And it will be less destabilizing if you have a government of a country that is autocratic, that is a dictatorship, that is highly authoritarian. Under those circumstances, the people are allowed to, it will be acceptable for people to assert their self-determination. But if the government of a country is a democracy, so I'll call it democracy, it's a functional democracy, it respects all the rights of people, self-determination will be allowed. But that form of self-determination will be an internal self-determination, where people are allowed to manage their own local affairs. And we've seen instances of that. The clearest example we see is in South Africa, which I don't think many people have paid attention to. South Africa, of course, is a unitary state. When I hear some other countries project the unitary state as the state where you build a nation, where you bring about national unity, it doesn't necessarily follow. People in every country want to be in charge of their local affairs, to control their own local affairs, and to be respected as a people within the different states, as a group. It has often surprised me that African states talk about sovereign equality of states, right? That's what they say, and they proclaim it from rooftops. But they do not accept the sovereign equality of the component people within the territories. And in most cases on the continent, we have seen one ethnic group lording over the other groups within the state. That has always been and will continue to be a recipe for violence within African states. And we've seen this happening. Why would you want one state to subject itself to another component ethnicity that is trying to impose itself on that? So I think the moment African countries begin to realize that it is always good to empower the people. So at the periphery, we have people in charge of local governments, they manage their own affairs, and they feel comfortable within that state, and they feel that they're stakeholders within the country. The moment they begin to feel that there are no stakeholders, and that what we call the state is so distant from them, it produces nothing worthwhile for them, that is when people begin to seek to opt out. And opting out is not only opting out. If you accept an opting in, you must be able to accept the opting out. And that's where the question of exit comes. And we've seen countries that have been exiting from organizations, like the UK Brexit, like recently Nicaragua that exited from OS because they feel uncomfortable. Or in African continent, the three states of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso exited from the West African Union. Why? Because the reason they gave us, that organization has ceased to be serving the interests of their respective peoples, and they don't see how they can participate in that. So this is a phenomenon which we often must take into account. Finally, the issue of territorial integrity. Every people that have asserted a right of self-determination does so within a clearly well-defined territory. We're talking about two cases here. The Republic of Somaliland its borders were very clear as the former British Trust Territory of Somaliland. And its independence is asserted within those borders. It has not affected and does not affect the borders of what used to be Italian Somaliland, which calls itself now Somalia. The same thing happens when we look across over to the Western Sahara. The Western Sahara is not claiming an inch of Moroccan territory. Its claim is within the boundaries of the Western Sahara. And Morocco achieved independence from France in 1956 within clearly well-defined boundaries. And the fact that Morocco has been on goose chase, one moment it tries to get to Algeria to grab territory, it fails. Then it comes to Western Sahara, where it arranged with Mauritania. Mauritania in the end said, no, I'm not interested in that. It even grabbed the territory which it arranged to give to Mauritania. So that shows me a country which does not appear to know exactly where its borders are. You cannot have a state that hasn't got borders, a state that got shifting borders. There's no such thing in international law. You can't have a state that says, I have no borders. Tomorrow I'll change my borders. Next day I'll change my borders. They are not a state. And that kind of a state cannot claim territorial integrity because the integrity of a territory is within well-defined borders. And in our African context here, the OAU and now the AU put the matter beyond any doubt because Article 4B makes it very clear that every African country must stick within the borders it had on the day of its independence. If only African countries could respect that principle, I think we would all feel more comfortable here. The problem is some African countries feel that they can expand and grab what they perceive to be weaker, smaller territories. That is a problem. If the Western Sahara was a bigger country, let us assume Western Sahara was like Mali, would Morocco dare try to do that? It wouldn't. Or if I may divert, if French Cameroon saw British Cameroon as a territory that was bigger, like Nigeria or Tanzania or whatever, Congo, would it dare to do that? It wouldn't. It is because of the perception that these are smaller territories, and therefore they have to expand what we call territorial aggrandizement, which is impermissible. Finally, in the case of Somaliland or Somalia, I believe that Somalia should weed itself from this notion of trying to construct greater Somalia that has failed. It has brought a lot of sorrow and suffering to the people of the Horn of Africa. When they try to do that, to grab Djibouti, to grab part of Kenya, to grab part of Ethiopia, and so on and so forth. That kind of a quest will bring total chaos and destabilize the whole continent. And that is why things, concepts like expansionism or territorial aggrandizement is impermissible. I will halt for that moment for now.
Thank you very much, Professor Carlson, for those reflections. It's particularly interesting that you're connecting understanding, statehood to context, time period, unmaking, remaking. Perhaps, further on in the discussion, you as well as the SCI researchers can talk to this anomaly of actually reversal, with Somaliland and Taiwan, where states reverse their recognition. But to take up your point about more likely to be accepted if it's peaceful, perhaps this is where I can bring in Professor Reddy. Professor Reddy, are you with us? Great.
Yes. Thank you for inviting me. I think I will start by a number of issues which we need to have clarification. There is a confusion. Now, for me, there is a difference between self-determination and secession. And then probably I would just mention 4 or 5 points which need clarification. One is, what is self-determination? The second is, what is secession? Who are people? That is also an issue when we talk people with the right to form their own state. Who are people? How do you define people? then the claim of a people, and then external view, usually in terms of, or in sociology, we say the subjective definition of identity and the objective definition, which is the subjective refers to how people define themselves, or a group or individuals define themselves. The objective is how the external actors or group see those claims. Probably the final point is the role of geopolitics. Is it enough to have the right to self-determination and consummate your statehood or state formation? What does people mean unless there is a geopolitical cloth which allows people to get that rights? So these are some of the points which we need to have a clear understanding and a clear definition. So let me start by explaining my view on self-determination and secession. I think in the quote, I don't know where from, as if I'm saying self-determination leading to secession. For me, self-determination and secession are two different things. When we talk about self-determination, usually in the context of Africa, it is related to decolonization. People's right to determine their political future. When we say people, those people who have been under foreign, especially subjected to European colonialism. So self-determination in its original and classical meaning has to do with the principle of decolonization. Those people who have been subjected to European rule and have been under European domination has the right, the entitlement to exercise self-determination, leading to create their own state. But also self-determination has three component elements. One is outright state formation. You can create your state. Second is you can opt for union. The third is for autonomy. So self-determination is the right, the entitlement to decide which way to go, whether you want to outright state formation or statehood, or do you want union, like what the Somaliland did in 1960 after 4 days of independence, or do you want an autonomy, which means a linguistic or cultural rights within the state without opting or creating your state. So to me, self-determination is the right to exercise those options you have, either outright creation of a state or union or autonomy. While secession is simply opting an exit and creation of own state. There are no other alternatives. But also much more important to the two concepts is when we talk about self-determination, there are legal, political, and moral entitlement related to both. In self-determination, it is seen from a legal, political, and moral point of view positively. If you say people have the right to self-determination, you give the connotation of legal, political, and moral entitlement. So what it means is when we talk about self-determination, we are talking about a people who have legal, political, and moral entitlement for whatever they decide, which is incorporated within the concept of self-determination. When it comes to secession, it is the contrary. Usually, there is a connotation referring to secession as a negative, where there is no moral, political, and legal entitlement. So in that sense, usually we see secession as a negative, while self-determination has an inherent positive characteristics. So there is this distinction. And usually when we talk about Africa or in the African context, self-determination is the people who have been colonized, whose identity, whose territoriality has been defined by colonial powers, and then they have the right to determine their future rights. That's why we talk about Western Sahara, the last case of decolonization, because Western Sahara is a creation of colonial artifact, but still it was not given the entitlement to exercise to determine its future. So that's why usually Western Sahara is seen as a remnant of the decolonization process, the last territory which has not been able to decide its own future. Now, there are some discussions that everyone has to be given the right of self-determination to determine. Now, if we say that, where does it end? Do we confine that right to territorially, politically, culturally, linguistically, clearly delineated and defined people? Or do you go down to the ethnic, to the tribe, to the clan, to whatever it is? Because any group can claim the right to self-determination. Now, even within Somaliland, there are some clans which does not adhere to the Somaliland's claim to its own statehood. The Sul and Sanug area, for instance, they don't want to be part of an independent Somaliland. In fact, now they have opted out and they have created their own region. So the issue of, I think, self-determination and secession has to be clearly defined. Of course, I'm not a lawyer, or I don't know the international law. Now, the case of Somaliland, Somaliland has been given the right to exercise self-determination when in 1960 became independent for 5 years, and then voluntarily, when Italian Somaliland became independent, opted to join or for union, which is one of the criteria of self-determination. Because, as I say, self-determination, you have 3 options: union, independence, or autonomy. So Somaliland opted for union, which means Somaliland has consummated the right to self-determination. Now the question is, does Somaliland have the right now to say, no, I regretted the union and I am retrieving my right to self-determination? Because Somaliland is claiming on the basis of colonial creation, because it's saying, I am separate from the rest of Somalia because Somaliland has been created by British Somaliland. So the question, especially for those who are lawyers is, does a country have the right to say, I made a mistake by consummating the right to secession, to self-determination and opting for union, but now they are trying to regain the right to self-determination based on colonial creation. So these are a number of issues which we need clarification. Probably.
Professor, can I ask you perhaps to maybe speak for another minute, and we'll move on to the next panelist and we'll come back to you.
Well, I'm just closing because there are some cases theoretically which support secession. There are less known theories which we call the theory of suffering. If a people has been suffering for a long time, like the South Sudanese, then they have the right to exercise self-determination up to secession. That is also followed by the theory called the remedy theory, remedial theory, where there has been suffering, so it has to be remedied. And then probably, which I want to point is the theory of distance, the cultural distance. Now, one of the problems Somaliland has is there is no cultural distance or cultural difference from the rest, while South Sudan has a complete cultural difference. So that is in some theoretical strands called the cultural distance, which might entitle for the people to opt and create their own state formation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Reddy. I think that really helps to expand that table that was set out in terms of what are the other variables that play a role in recognition. And it's particularly interesting that you raise the issues of moral. All right, how do you measure moral in the international system, but also legal, which brings us, I think, nicely to our next panelist, which is Ms. Kendra Konak. And she will hopefully tell us about what role the international or the external plays in recognition.
Thank you so much, Dr. Small, and thank you to Saya as well for letting us all come together and speak about an issue that we're all clearly very interested in, a very complex issue of statehood and these cases in particular. I feel as though it's a bit of a tough act to follow with my former colleagues from SIA giving such a lovely presentation to start off the session, and now such incredible remarks from our esteemed professors. So I will try add my 2 cents, and hopefully there's something worthwhile amidst what I have to say. In terms of the role of international allies and, friendly states, friends in the international system for both territories that are seeking recognition and then also the parent states that are seeking to withhold recognition, there is a lot to say here. It's kind of well known that there are differing opinions in terms of how much weight recognition carries in the recognition of states. There are the differing schools of thought, a constitutive and a declaratory school of thought, which place different emphasis on, is recognition a necessity in, achieving full statehood, or is it something that is an added extra, something nice to have? And I suppose depending on your personal proclivities, you might ascribe to one school of thought over another, but the realities of the international system kind of indicate to us that a fair amount of emphasis is placed on recognition. Would-be states really need recognition from other states in order to cross that final hurdle and become full-blown recognized states in the international system. In some cases, the issue of non-recognition also plays a really big role. Non-recognition of a territory or recognition of the parent state over a would-be state has a lot to say in determining whether that state becomes a state or not. You think in the case of the SADR, specifically the remarks made by America in 2020 under the Trump presidency, recognizing the sovereignty of the Kingdom of Morocco over the SADR, set a tone internationally and kind of indicated to a lot of other states that this was an issue not to be trifled with. Unfortunately, the issue was never walked back. In fact, in 2021, the new administration under Biden specifically said, we're not going to walk back our statements. And so having a massive superpower, if we even refer to it in those terms anymore, like the US specifically saying we recognize the sovereignty of a parent state, really goes a long way in stalling the process for a would-be state coming to full recognition. As much as traditional IR theory, a theory like realism would say that the system is all completely self-help and it's every state for themselves, a little bit of help from a friendly state does go a long way. And so engaging in processes of diplomacy, whether traditional or digital, like Laura spoke about, gaining allies, gaining bilateral partnerships, and having some other states on your side when making the case for your recognition does go quite a long way in that journey and that quest towards becoming a full-blown state. I'll also just speak quickly on the other dynamic, the other kind of elephant in the room, which is the issue of geopolitics. I think generally speaking, a role that geopolitics has to play in issues like this is it becomes a bit of an attractor of attention. These cases have been going on for many, many years now, and often they lie dormant for a really long time until an issue arises that places them back on the agenda. So like I mentioned, the US's recognition of Moroccan sovereignty, that placed the SADR's case back on the agenda until everyone forgot about it. More recently, a big sort of geopolitical moment was this deal struck between Ethiopia and Somaliland, a memorandum of understanding that was signed earlier this year. And that has brought a lot of attention to the case and to the plight of Somaliland in looking for recognition and independence as their own state. Just a little bit about what the MOU actually did. Essentially, Ethiopia gains access, a 50-year lease to 20 kilometers of sea and coastline that belongs to Somaliland or is part of Somaliland's territory. That's a big deal for Ethiopia because they now have access to the Red Sea again. In return, Somaliland has actually received stakes in Ethiopian Airlines, which I think is an interesting bargaining chip to use, but it also goes back to this question of recognition. Signing a deal with an established state in your region sends quite a big message for Somaliland. It kind of shows, look, we have other states that are willing to engage with us on economic terms and on diplomatic terms, so pay attention to us in a way. But unfortunately, it hasn't been plain sailing. There are factions within Somaliland that have protested against the deal. They feel it's selling a piece of themselves. It's allowing external intervention in aspects of their internal and their domestic affairs. Obviously, Somalia itself has protested very loudly to this memorandum of understanding as being an encroachment on their sovereignty as a state. So it's brought a lot of attention to Somaliland's case, but not necessarily in the right way. So geopolitics can help in putting an issue back on the agenda, but it's kind of distracting from the original issue, which is that Somaliland wants independence. And so in that sense, sometimes geopolitics can be more of a detractor and more of a complication to a situation than offering real strategies for working out an issue or real strategies towards achieving statehood. I think I'll stop there.
Great, thank you very much for those comments, Kendra. And I'll just remind the audience, if you can please place your questions into the Q&A as we go along. We do have a few questions that have come so far, so if I can ask all the presenters, including the researchers and as well as the panelists, to put on their cameras. I'm going to roll out one general question, and then I will give specific questions that have been listed. So just in terms of all our contributors today, there is a question about what you all think about Palestine, right? We're in this historical moment and all the variables that you've all mentioned, from violence to peace, moral, the theory of suffering, legal, external allies, ending with Kenra now. All of those are playing out, right? So what do all of the panelists and the contributors think in terms of Palestine's recognition, which has been long recognized by about 138 states, but recently joined by Norway, Spain, and Ireland, which Stephen points out came into effect today. And then specific questions, if I can just tag onto those, and if the speakers can record them. There's one for Laura, which comes from Mustafa Ahmad. The memorandum of understanding with Ethiopia. Also thinks it was a lovely presentation. And then there is another question about Somaliland and Ethiopia, saying that, you know, this is a big step forward, and it's a strategic step forward. But Somaliland has not been mobilizing effectively enough with African states. And I think this comes to the point about allies and friendliness. So perhaps that is also something you can comment on, Kendra. So I will pass it around to everybody, if everybody can comment for 2 minutes. And if we start with Isabel, Laura, moving on to Professor Carlson, Professor Reddy, and then to Kendra. Okay, we seem to have some, there we go, there we've got Isabel.
We are having some network difficulties. Laura and I are sharing a computer now. So I'm gonna quickly pass to her while she's there, to speak about the digital paper.
Well, thank you very much for the question. And I really wish that I have had the opportunity to do such a deep dive into Somaliland's digital diplomacy since the MOU has been signed, but unfortunately I haven't. Just from an observation standpoint, I think that it could have gone both ways, but I think that the Somaliland government has continued its digital diplomacy in the way that it had before. I don't think it's significantly changed how it has used digital diplomacy or its strategy. What I have seen and what I have noticed is that it also hasn't changed external relations with the Somaliland government on using social media. I think that we were just discussing this before we started, as the United Kingdom has said in this case, we'll be the second state to recognize you. And I think that's the stance that a lot of partners are taking, in that they don't want to overemphasize this as a movement, and they also don't want to they're just very cautious in what they're doing. So we've seen from both sides. We've seen the recent joint statement by Denmark, the EU, Germany, Norway, Sweden, the UK, recognizing and welcoming the date setting for the election. So on one hand, they are still supporting that the democratic institution carries on in this way. But we've also seen the Somaliland government having to come out very strongly against the G7 statement, which called the region, the Somaliland region of Somalia. So we've seen that it hasn't significantly, it hasn't pushed the international community to immediately say, okay, well, this is a step forward. We're all going to be ready to accept this as a movement forward, and we're not going to do the same yet. Thank you very much. I think I'll stop there.
I can't, okay, I know the question on the digital diplomacy subject was specifically directed at Laura, so I'm not going to add anything more there. However, just to say, do you want me to just say about the digital paper? It's not available yet.
Yeah, just sorry, there's a question in the chat about asking for the paper. Unfortunately, it hasn't been published yet. It has been accepted by WITS, and it's going to be uploaded onto the repository soon, but it's not yet. But I can share the link as soon as it is uploaded. Thank you.
There we go.
Some comments on Palestine, seeing that is so freshly topical at the moment.
Yes, indeed, as you said at the start, the discussion that we're having today is especially topical in light of that, and many other territories also seeking self-determination. And I think we can really refer here to comments that have already been made by some of our other panelists, especially looking at international law and the right to self-determination. I think it's really just a kind of natural progression of ongoing efforts for many years of the recognition of Palestinian statehood. I think the 3 countries that have now expressed their recognition, it's certainly, I think, weighty. And it will remain to be seen now if any other states will follow suit, what this might mean, how this might play out in the UN. I think similar to the conclusion we make in our paper, we need to just kind of watch this space. I don't think there are any hard predictions on what the outcome is going to be. And yeah, those are my thoughts. Laura, do you want anything? Okay, we can go to our other panelists.
Great, thank you. Professor Carlson?
Yeah, thank you. First thing, the distinction which is tried to be made between secession and self-determination, I'm not too sure what that means. I want to say that self-determination is no longer a political concept. International law is clear on what self-determination is all about. If you look at the ICCPR Article 1, Common Article 1 of ICCPR and ICER, if you look at the African Charter, it's clear what self-determination is about. And if we apply that yardstick, we want to ask, the present situation which is happening now in Palestine, because if we talk about remedial secession as a remedy, it will put long suffering. The Palestinians have been suffering from so long. What is going on there? Is it a case of self-determination? Or is it a case of secession? Are the Palestinians or Palestine under colonial rule? And you add the word apartheid, there are researches which have been done to show that actually it's under colonial domination. And if it's under colonial domination, hasn't it got a right to opt out, to fight for that? And who is fighting out for that? Are you going to classify that as simply a case of self-determination, or you are going to say this is a case of secession? So the point I'm trying to make here is that quite apart from the fact that self-determination is now a legal right, firmly entrenched in the international system, the ICCPR, the African Charter, the Declaration of Granting of Independence to colonial territories. It talks of granting of independence to colonial territories. Now, that all this instrument, like I said earlier, every African country has seceded from the owner of the territory, and the owner was the colonial person, the colonial master. So when you secede from that territory, because that in law, that was the territory of the colonizer. We talk of the British territory, colonial territory, French colonial, Italian colonial, it's their territory. So by Africans fighting, they fought to liberate themselves, assert their right, and the basis for that, the right of self-determination, which they used to say we need to get out of it. So that's the first thing we have to bear in mind. The second thing I just want also to say is that the point we have just made about recognition, which is key. Whether you are talking about secession, try to make a distinction between secession and self-determination. Either way you go, it's a question of recognizing. Somebody has to recognize you as a member of the international community. Then you can have the rights and privilege of being a member of that community. Furthermore, if, as we say, that it is permissible to make that distinction, who is it that gave the country that seeks to decolonize the option which I hear being talked about, the question of Or do you want to form a union? Do you want to stay on your own? And so on and so forth. The only situation where that has happened is a situation where there have been a referendum or a plebiscite. And in some cases, those referenda or plebiscite have not been complete in giving all of those options. So I don't think it's profitable to construct that distinction on that particular basis. The Kosovo case, was it a case of self-determination? Was it a case of decolonization? And I don't think we are looking at a very restrictive way of saying colonization limited to white colonization. Why limited to white colonization? There is no text, no law which says colonization means white colonization only. Because I suspect African countries are saying that to exercise themselves from African on African colonialism. Why would one African country seek to colonize another African country and claim that, and we claim that because it's not white colonialism, then it is not colonialism, as if colonialism has a color. So on that reasoning, the white race will come and colonize us, and that won't be colonialism because it's not white colonialism. So if we look at the situation of Somaliland, for example, and I've said this before, I don't see how it is very feasible for Somalia to claim back Somaliland, if only because you don't push people to where they don't want to go to, where they're uncomfortable. Somalia is deeply embroiled in chaos and violence. And we're saying a country that has been steady, conducting elections and free for the past 30 years should come now and be part of that chaos? Who's going to accept that? Which people are going to accept that? In the name of what? I don't understand, as has been pointed out, this whole question of geopolitics, trying to trump the law. That's what it's been trying, but it will not succeed. And in many instances, we have situations like this, those things do not succeed. The baseline is you cannot force a people where they are. The example of a people in Somaliland who don't want to be, if that is considered a legitimate concern, why wouldn't it be a legitimate concern for us to say that Somaliland would not be a part of Somalia? So my conclusion is that the only way we resolve these issues is African states stop, one, trying to expand the territories where they had at independence. Two, if they gave up this whole idea of greater Somaliland or greater Morocco or greater whatsoever, those things are constructs which do not work in this day and age, where people are trying to assert the ability and the right to be able to govern themselves, mind themselves, and feel free. We must deconstruct the center in African countries, where everything happens in the capital city, and the whole country means the capital city. Because people in the periphery, they want to feel part of a country. The moment you exclude them, you cannot exclude them at the same time you want them to be. It doesn't work that way. So those are for the time being, my own remarks on the issue of Somaliland, the issue of Morocco, and the issue of Palestine, which I think they have a very, very compelling case with the kind of suffering they've been going for so long. And we see it, and it's been brought to the fore recently with all the killing that have been going there. And the state of Israel completely ignoring everybody, including the UN, including the International Court of Justice. And we think that is good, that's okay, just because you find that Palestine is a weaker. And this is what I'm saying. One country finds its neighbor, it perceives it as weak, and therefore it must expand and grab it. And the world will just stand and watch. So I don't think that is correct.
Thank you very much, Professor Carlson, for bringing us back to the contentions around criteria and constructs. And perhaps this is where I can bring Professor Reddy back in. And to add to that, there's also this contention around distinctions. There's a question in the chat about similarities between the concept of irredentism and that of secession. So that is for you, Professor Reddy.
Thank you. First of all, there are two component elements in statehood and recognition. That is the one what we call de facto or empirical, and the second is the jure, that is you become member of the international state system, which is the international state system should recognize you and accept you as a member. So that is the legal aspect in international law, where you become a sovereign and independent state. The de facto or empirical is you have your own territory, your own people, and you have internal administration. So for a sovereignty, the two has to match, and it's a combination of the two elements. A territory or a people or a country could be an independent. If one is missing, then there is no recognition and there is no statehood. This is clearly exemplified by the fact of Somaliland. Somaliland is a de facto independent, but it is not a de jure independent. So that is what problem Somaliland is facing. Now, self-determination, secession, just when I refer to those distinctions, is simply when self-determination was applied in the case of the African continent, in the African context, that is related directly to decolonization. So if we come to the issue of Palestine, probably we need to go to 1948 or 1967. Based on the 1948 and 1967, you have, at least in principle, two different or separate states, the state of Israel and the state of Palestinian. The problem is the Palestinians, even though they have international legal right for recognition, but the de jure, which has been combined with geopolitics, they couldn't extract the de jure recognition. Otherwise, Palestine is not part of Israel. Based on the 1948 formation and 1967 territorial delineation and demarcation. So what we have is two independent states, but because of geopolitics and of military power, Israel has succeeded to occupy Palestine. So that is my view, and I think the statehood and sovereignty of Palestine has happened very, very, very long ago, but because of geopolitics, they haven't got it. Now, the issue of Somaliland and the Memorandum of Understanding, I think there is a confusion here. Ethiopia never said we will recognize Somaliland. What many assumed, but also what was claimed, is from the Somaliland side. Otherwise, there was no statement, there is no any expression from the Ethiopian side saying that they will recognize Somaliland. In fact, for them was, if they could get the territory, which is 20 kilometers for seaport and military naval base, then they will compensate Somaliland by giving them share in the airline or the electricity, whatever it is. So they never explicitly said, we will recognize Somaliland. It only came from the Somaliland side. And then also, we should not forget the tripartite agreement between Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, which was signed in 2018. In that agreement, clearly in the preamble, there are three principles. One is non-interference in internal affairs, respect sovereignty, territorial integrity, which means Somaliland has been considered in that agreement as part of Somaliland. So therefore, Ethiopia has said, we respect territorial integrity and sovereignty of Somaliland, including Somaliland within Somalia. So I am not saying the Somalilanders do not deserve independence or sovereignty. There is a case where there could be a mutual consensus. The mutual consensus was what led to the independence of South Sudan. If the Khartoum government would have said, no, I don't think South Sudan could have been independent. And now, because Mogadishu is saying no, Somaliland could not get independence. And then we should not forget the hierarchical structure within the African continent. Somaliland has to go through the Regional Economic Community, IGAD. From IGAD, it has to go to the African Union. From the African Union to the United Nations. South Sudan went through the same process. IGAD mediated and then came to the African Union, from the African Union to the United Nations. And Somalilanders have been told again and again, if you can get recognition from IGAD, if you can get recognition from the African Union, we'll immediately recognize you. This is the big powers who have been telling them. So we should not forget that process, that hierarchical structural arrangement which we have within the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Reddy, on ending on that point about this hierarchy and de jure recognition, which I think allows Kendra to come in here. About allies, you mentioned the US as being a very strong ally, either for a de facto state or parent state. So perhaps you can give some final reflections around this in relation to these cases and to Palestine.
Sure, thank you. I keep coming back to something that Dr. Small said in introducing what we're trying to do here, and she referred to statehood as being anomalies and contradictions. And that's kind of sticking in my brain because it's sort of the best way to describe how we grapple with statehood and whether we consider it to be completely abiding by international law and by sort of checkpoints that we check the points, we get the recognition, we become a state, or if there are greater complexities to all of this. And part of those complexities is who we have on our side, in a way. Whether you have 80 states recognizing you, but none of them is a permanent 5 member of the UNSC, that obviously is a very complex situation to deal with. If you have no one else recognizing you but a permanent 5 member on your side, could that tip the scales in a different direction? What's kind of stood out to me through the process of researching for this paper and what we've heard today, statehood is not a cut and dry process. It's not linear and it's not replicatable. What has worked for one state doesn't necessarily or hardly ever works for another state. And although we're speaking specifically about 2 case studies here and then the 2 extra case studies on the African continent, you can't speak about statehood without speaking about Palestine, without speaking about Taiwan, because they are these sort of anomalies in the international system that no one truly knows how to deal with because there are so many different views on how to deal with them. And so that's just, as Isabel says, it's a bit of a watch this space scenario where we don't know who's going to come next in terms of recognition. Palestine obviously challenges our notions on, if you have 2/3 of the international system recognizing you as a state, shouldn't you automatically be a state? But they're not a state. And then on the other hand, if you don't have enough recognition, but you meet all the criteria according to the Montevideo Convention, are you a state or aren't you a state? And so it's this uncomfortable tension that exists. Is statehood an absolute? Can a state be half a state or not a state at all? And how exactly do you go about the process of becoming a fully fledged state and receiving the recognition that you desire? And so in that sense, we watch with bated breath in terms of all of these case studies for SADR, for Somaliland, for Palestine, which is obviously very newsworthy at the moment and on every headline that we look at on our cell phones and on our TVs. But there's no prediction to be made because there's no frame of reference of this is the process that one goes about to become a state. And so it is just a case of let's wait and see what happens next, unfortunately.
Great. Thank you very much, Kendra. I see it is now 14:24. So we are really pushing for time. I didn't get to provoke you all with how do we explain reversals? How do we explain Taiwan? So perhaps, Saya, you need to host another session. There's also a question we didn't get to, which I am just raising to tell Laura about how extensive digital diplomacy is by DIRCO. So perhaps, again, another session on this. But thank you very much to all our contributors. I will now hand you back to Stephen Groots, and he will do a vote of thanks and close for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and for the excellent chairing and the insightful comments and directing the traffic. So a big thank you to you. Also a big thank you to the authors of the paper, Isabel, Laura, and Kendra. We miss you, Kendra. Great to see you flourishing at WITS. And also to my team for putting today together. People have asked, will there be a recording? I believe you can get it on the SIRE Facebook page, and it's probably also on YouTube as well. So you will be able to watch the entire session. And just to say thank you to everybody for coming, and to the professors, Professor Carlson, Professor Reddy, for really insightful remarks, and for participating and making it an international panel. Just finally, there's some other cases that we haven't talked about. You know, what about Namibia's long road to independence from South Africa, as well as Kosovo? What happens when the state that you're trying to secede from really doesn't want you to secede? And as Kendra said, but the big powers support you. So, you know, do we have rules, or do we just have things that apply depending on power? But we will leave it there. I don't want to open another whole can of worms. Just to say thank you to everybody, and have a wonderful day further. And if you're in South Africa, please go and vote tomorrow. Thank you. The webinar is now closed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.